The Midwest. Well known for its crazy weather, its friendly residents, and its interesting food combinations, it's a region with many cities. And while some people might discount them because of their decline in the 20th century, I'd argue that a lot of these cities are better than some of the fastest growing cities in the US. Jacksonville and Nashville. But if you've watched my videos before, you'll know I'm a big fan of the tier list. So let's rank the cities of the Midwest. I did make some changes in terms of the methodology. I'm still going to be using WalkScore to quantify the walking, cycling, and transit data because it does offer a solid baseline for this. However, I decided to quantify two other variables. The first one being rent. I'm quantifying rent in a score out of 50 because while I think it is really important for cities, I don't think it's as important as their walking, cycling, and transit infrastructure. And I've also decided to quantify my own vibes. I'm doing this out of a score of 10. Essentially, it's going to be kind of the tiebreaker in the voting. This means that every score will be out of 360 points. Now, just a reminder, guys, that these are my opinions and I love constructive feedback, so just let me know respectfully if you agree or disagree. As well as a fair reminder that just because your city makes a certain ranking on this list, that doesn't mean that my other lists are comparable. I'm just doing this tier list specifically for the Midwest. And let's be honest, some regions of the US just have more walkable cities than others. But anyways, get your cheese curds, popcorn, and puppy chow ready because it's time to get into the list. Alright, let's get this out of the way. Chicago is the undisputed best city in terms of transit and zoning in the entire Midwest, hands down. And there's a lot to love about Chicago, from its transit with the CTA to its walkable neighborhoods all around the city. However, Chicago isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Its regional rail system, Metro, while it is improving, is still well behind a lot of other comparable services in other cities. CTA has definitely struggled in recent years from negligent management at the top. Also, while there is some bike infrastructure, it lags behind a lot of other cities in protected bike lanes. And yeah, out of all the Midwest cities, Chicago is far and away the most expensive to rent in. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of other options in Chicago that are cheaper than this average number, but rent in Chicago has climbed pretty significantly in the past few years. I grew up outside of Chicago, and I personally love the vibes of this city. Despite the few problems, you can't go wrong with Chicago. S tier. The Motor City definitely has its fair share of sprawl around the outer parts of the city. The city and surrounding metro areas are both served by two different transit agencies. DDOT for bus services in the city, and SMART for bus services in the surrounding metro area. These bus services could definitely see some frequency improvements and bus lanes, but they do have some pretty good network coverage. On top of this, the core of the city is also served by the People Mover, which runs kind of an odd circular route but is kind of effective. And then there's also the Q line, a streetcar line connecting downtown and midtown Detroit. While transit is on the weaker end, the city gets its biggest boost from its pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. And with really affordable rent prices in the city, it really helps it out in the ratings. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the vibes of Detroit, but the city is definitely going in the right direction, and I'm gonna put it in the B tier. Minneapolis has definitely been doing some great work to stand out from the pack when it comes to city planning. They've been working on quite a few different transit projects throughout the city, from LRT extensions to more rapid bus lines being created, and improved service on its one commuter rail line. The city does well with transit, but it is truly standing out for its bike infrastructure. A lot of people in the cycling community are really putting Minneapolis on the same tier as Portland in terms of bike infrastructure, and some even rank it higher. But the city has done a great job of making it easier to get around by bike. And with the city also doing a ton of mixed-use zoning for new apartments, it has kept the rent from increasing in the city over the past couple of years. The city with the combined scores actually ranks higher than Chicago. And while I definitely would say it's nowhere near the transit city that Chicago is, if you don't want to pay Chicago prices for good pedestrian-forward cities, then Minneapolis is a great choice. S tier. One thing you'll notice about a lot of these Midwest cities is that they're definitely pretty transit and zoning forward, even when they don't have a ton of cash to work with. And this is definitely the case for St. Louis. While the bus system definitely needs some improvements in frequency, and the light rail does too, they're both pretty solid at getting you between the walkable neighborhoods of St. Louis. They've even done a pretty decent job of infill development in a lot of these different neighborhoods, making them more walkable. Bike infrastructure, though, could definitely use some more work with some protected bike lanes around the city. Like many other Rust Belt cities in the Midwest on this list, even in some of the most high-end neighborhoods of the city, rent is still pretty affordable. St. Louis is far from perfect, but I liked the vibes of the city, and with its score, it's gonna get put comfortably in the A tier. Look, most cities usually have their controversy on my lists with their placements. I think the Steel City's gonna have its controversy even being on this list, because guess what? In my mind, Pittsburgh is a Midwestern city, and you can just cope with that. Pittsburgh, like a lot of other cities on this list, suffered from urban renewal in the 20th century that pretty much flattened its downtown area. But the city has done a lot to improve its walking and cycling infrastructure within the city. Also, I'm not gonna lie, I love the LRT system that Pittsburgh has. It definitely needs to be expanded, and inside of the downtown area, the service is free to ride. It does, however, cost money to leave downtown, with a 3-hour unlimited pass costing $2.75. It's kind of like how if you want extra content on my channel, you can always join my Patreon, but unlike PRT, my Patreon starts at just $1, where you can get your name in the credits of my videos, early access to my video content, and also extra video content. But anyways, back into the video. Pittsburgh also has some really great BRT lines in the city too. Rent is on the higher end for the Midwest, but compared to the rest of the country, that's pretty reasonable. I'm hoping that the city can do some more infill to provide more room for housing and business, and I'm gonna put Pittsburgh in the B tier. Cincinnati is really quite the contrasting city. On one hand, the city has some huge highway interchanges just outside of downtown. The edge of the city is loaded with car-dependent sprawl, and the city, like Detroit, lacks a real rail transit system and mostly relies on buses. However, the neighborhoods around Cincinnati's downtown are honestly some of the best walkable neighborhoods in the Midwest, and arguably the country. I'm a huge fan of neighborhoods like Over the Rhine and Mount Adams. The city's core is incredible for walking, cycling, and transit, but unfortunately for Cincinnati, this list takes a look at the whole city. And while Cincinnati has some amazing urbanism with some of the lowest rent prices in the Midwest, it has a lot of car-dependent planning. So I'm gonna put them in the C tier. Kansas City is pretty similar to a few other cities on this list, with loads of downtown highways and poor zoning and car-dependent neighborhoods throughout the city, but a pretty walkable downtown. There's a single streetcar line, which I did make a video about, and a few rapid bus lines. Most of the transit in the city is free, which is actually a huge benefit, but still, the sprawl of the city is wild, and downtown KC definitely needs more infill development. The city is planning to do some extensions to the streetcar, which would be great in the future, but for now, even with its rent being on the lower side, KC is going in the F tier. As someone who talks a lot about cities, I rarely think about Columbus, and mostly it's because it commits to the urbanist sin of not having any rail transit. The city does have some okay bus service, as it has to provide transit to students at The Ohio State University, but outside of the neighborhoods around the campus and downtown, Columbus is kind of a bloated suburban nightmare. To me, it really doesn't feel like a city as much as Cincinnati or Cleveland do, but hey, this is Ohio, so at least you'll have some dirt cheap rent. Hopefully Columbus can get some rail transit in the city or to other cities soon. And with its scores, I'm gonna put it in the D tier. The center of the Hoosier state, Indianapolis is a city that's held back by its own state. With light rail literally being banned from the state, it's hard for the city to invest in anything other than car infrastructure. The city does have a BRT program being built out called Indigo, which is pretty good, but the scores for the city are incredibly low just due to the fact that the city is incredibly car dependent. It gets Amtrak service once every couple of days from Amtrak's Cardinal, but the city really needs to do some serious transit improvement. The rent here, however, is incredibly cheap. So if you like having a car payment to offset the low rent, then I guess Indianapolis is for you. F tier. This is one of the many Midwestern cities that punches above its weight. Cleveland, like a lot of other cities on this list, has a lot of sprawl, but Cleveland does a pretty good job of managing it with building transit. It has one of the better BRT lines in the country with the Health Line, 2 LRT lines, and the only other heavy rail metro outside of Chicago. The city has some decent cycling infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure. The main problem with a lot of Cleveland neighborhoods is that they need to do some sort of infill development. Like seriously, Cleveland has some amazing blocks downtown, and then other blocks that are entirely surface parking. Let's get some more mixed-use development here. But overall, with pretty reasonable rents, Cleveland is a solid Midwest city B tier. largest suburb of Chicago, Milwaukee has done some great work to improve the walkability of its city, even when the state doesn't really support them. The city has a frequent rail connection to Chicago via Amtrak's Hiawatha. But in the city, Milwaukee has a solid bus network, including a rapid bus line with the Connect 1. The city also has a streetcar network that has been expanding and continuing to expand, which is great for the city. The city also has done some work to improve cycling, as well as some active plans to remove freeways in downtown. The city is not only pretty friendly to walk and cycle in, but it's also actively improving. Rent in Milwaukee is also affordable, being under $1,100 a month for the average one bed. Definitely a great option for walkability in the Midwest, and I'm gonna put it in the A tier. Alright, now here's a final recap of all the Midwestern cities ranked. How did you feel about this list? Would you change any of the rankings? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. Here's a thank you to everybody who helped me make this video, and here's a very special thank you to my patrons, especially Tony Stunts, who's in my Metro tier. Want to hear your name in the credits, access to videos early, and exclusive videos? Then join my Patreon. Also, don't forget to check out my socials, linked below. Thank you all for watching, and as always, I'll see y'all in the next one.